The highway stretched endlessly ahead, dotted with occasional farmhouses and gas stations. Sergeant David Johnson adjusted his rearview mirror and rubbed his tired eyes. He had been driving for nearly 8 hours straight, and the weight of the day was pressing down on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. The dress uniform he wore felt stiff and uncomfortable after sitting in the car for so long, but he couldn't bring himself to change out of it. Not yet. The memorial service had ended 3 hours ago, but David could still hear the 21-gun salute echoing in his mind. Another brother in arms had come home, but not the way anyone wanted. These ceremonies never got easier, no matter how many he attended. Each folded flag handed to a grieving family felt like a piece of his own heart being given away. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. A text from his sister asking if he was okay and reminding him that dinner would be ready whenever he arrived. David smiled slightly. Lisa always knew exactly what to say, even when she didn't say much at all. He was still 2 hours away from home, but the thought of sitting around her kitchen table with his nephews climbing all over him made the drive feel worthwhile. The fuel gauge was getting low, and David noticed a small green sign indicating food and gas at the next exit. He had passed dozens of similar signs, but something about this one caught his attention. Maybe it was the hand-painted edition that read, "Riley's Roadhouse, best burgers in 3 counties," that made him slow down and signal for the exit. Terry off-ramp led to a small town that looked like it had seen better days. Main Street was lined with closed storefronts and empty lots where buildings used to stand. A few pickup trucks were parked outside a hardware store, and an elderly man sat on a bench feeding pigeons. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and strangers stood out like sore thumbs. Riley's Roadhouse sat at the edge of town, a weathered building with neon beer signs flickering in the windows. The parking lot was mostly empty except for a cluster of motorcycles parked near the front entrance. They were big machines, chrome gleaming despite the dust from the road. Leather saddlebags hung from the sides, and various patches and stickers decorated the bikes like battle scars. From countless miles of highway, David pulled his sedan into a spot near the back of the lot and sat for a moment, watching the building. Through the windows he could see the warm glow of lights inside and the movement of people at the bar. He thought about driving to the gas station he had passed a mile back, but his stomach growled loudly, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since early that morning. The bell above the door chimed as David entered the roadhouse. The smell of fried food and cigarette smoke hit him immediately, mixed with the familiar scent of beer and old wood. The place had the comfortable, lived-in feel of a bar that had been serving the same customers for decades. Photographs of local high school football teams and hunting trips covered the walls, along with a few dusty trophy fish mounted above the bar. There were maybe a dozen people scattered throughout the room. A few locals sat at small tables, quietly, nursing their drinks and watching a baseball game on the television mounted in the corner. The bartender, a middle-aged woman with graying hair pulled back in a ponytail, looked up and nodded as David approached the bar. "What can I get you, honey?" she asked, wiping down the bar with a damp towel. Her voice was friendly but tired, the kind of hospitality that came from years of serving drinks to strangers passing through town. "Just a beer, please." "Whatever you have on tap," David replied, sliding onto a bar stool. The leather seat creaked under his weight, and he noticed how the brass footrail had been worn smooth by countless boots over the years. "Long day?" the bartender asked as she filled a glass with golden beer and set it in front of him. She had noticed his uniform, and her expression softened slightly. "My grandson just got back from overseas last month. Navy." David nodded and took a sip of his beer. "Something like that. Just heading home to see family." The woman smiled and moved on to serve another customer, leaving David alone with his thoughts. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through messages from friends and fellow soldiers. Everyone was checking on each other, the way they always did after losing someone. It was one of the things he loved most about the military family. No one ever had to grieve alone. From the corner of his eye, David noticed movement at a large round table in the back corner of the bar. 5 men sat there, all wearing leather vests over flannel shirts and jeans. Their conversation had been a low murmur when he first walked in, but now their voices were getting louder. David tried not to pay attention, focusing instead on his beer and the baseball game on the television. But it was hard to ignore the way their conversation kept pausing whenever he moved or reached for his drink. There was something in their tone that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. It was the same feeling he had gotten during his deployments when walking through unfriendly territory, the sense that eyes were watching and measuring him. The largest of the men, a guy, with graying hair and arms covered in tattoos, said something that made the others laugh. It wasn't a friendly laugh. David caught fragments of their words carried across the room by the overhead fans. Words that made his jaw tighten and his hand grip his beer glass a little harder. He had heard it all before, of course. Growing up in the South, serving in the military, traveling across the country, prejudice wasn't exactly rare. Most of the time, people kept their opinions to themselves or at least had the decency to wait until he was out of earshot. But there was something different about this group. They wanted him to hear. David finished half his beer and considered leaving. He wasn't looking for trouble, especially not today. All he wanted was to get home to his sister's house, hug his nephews, and try to forget about the ceremony for a few hours. But something kept him in his seat. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was just too tired to care anymore. The bartender returned with a bowl of peanuts, setting them down next to his glass. "Don't mind them," she said quietly, glancing toward the corner table. "They come in here every few weeks, make a lot of noise, and then move on. They're mostly harmless." David nodded his thanks, but he noticed that her hands were shaking slightly as she wiped down the already clean bar. Whatever mostly harmless meant to her, it was clear that these men made her nervous too. The television droned on about batting averages and pitching rotations, but David found himself listening more to the conversation behind him than to the game. Their voices were getting bolder, and he could feel the attention of the entire bar shifting in his direction. Even the locals at the other tables had gone quiet, sensing the change in atmosphere. David reached for his wallet, thinking it might be time to pay his tab and find somewhere else to eat. But as he did, the conversation at the corner table stopped completely. In the sudden silence, he could hear his own heartbeat and the distant hum of the air conditioning. He looked up at the mirror behind the bar and saw 5 pairs of eyes staring directly at him. The moment stretched out like a held breath, full of possibility and danger. David had faced enemy fire in foreign countries, but somehow this felt more personal. These weren't soldiers following orders, or ideological enemies fighting for their beliefs. These were just people who hated him for existing, for wearing his uniform, for having the audacity to stop for a beer in their town. He set his wallet on the bar and turned around slowly, meeting their stares directly. If this was going to happen, he wasn't going to run from it. The uniform he wore meant something, and the brother he had honored today deserved better than a retreat. The silence in the roadhouse felt thick enough to cut with a knife. David could feel every person in the room holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The baseball game continued playing on the television, but no one was watching anymore. All eyes were either on him or carefully looking anywhere else. The big man with the tattoo stood up first. His chair scraped against the wooden floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He was even larger standing up than he had appeared sitting down, easily 6 feet tall and built like someone who had spent years doing hard physical work. The leather vest he wore was covered with patches and pins. Some David recognized as motorcycle club symbols. Others he couldn't identify. "Well, well," the man said, his voice carrying easily across the room. "Look what we got here, boys." He took a step toward David, and the 4 other men at his table pushed back their chairs and stood as well. They moved with the casual confidence of people who were used to intimidating others, spreading out slightly as they approached. David remained seated on his bar stool, his hands resting calmly on the bar. Years of military training had taught him to stay cool under pressure, to assess a situation before reacting. He could feel his heart rate increase, but his breathing stayed steady. Behind the bar, the woman who had served him his beer had backed, away toward the cash register, her face pale with worry. "Tank, please," she said quietly. "He's not bothering anybody. He's just passing through." So the big man's name was Tank. David filed that information away while keeping his expression neutral. Tank glanced at the bartender with annoyance, as if she had interrupted something important. "Nobody asked you, Betty. Tea." Tank said without taking his eyes off David. "This is between me and our friend here in the fancy uniform." The way he said fancy uniform made it clear he didn't mean it as a compliment. David took a slow sip of his beer, buying himself time to think. There were 5 of them and 1 of him, but that wasn't what worried him most. What worried him was the way the other customers were studiously avoiding eye contact, the way Betty's hands were shaking, the way Tank's friends were positioning themselves to block the exits. This wasn't their first time doing this. "Nice outfit," one of Tank's buddies said, a thin man with a scraggly beard and nervous energy. "You play dress-up often, or is this a special occasion?" A few of the men chuckled, but it sounded forced. David noticed that not all of them seemed entirely comfortable with what was happening. The youngest of the group, barely old enough to drink, kept glancing toward the door like he was thinking about leaving. "It's a uniform," David replied calmly. "I was at a funeral today." "Aw, that's too bad," Tank said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Lose somebody important?" David felt anger flash through him, but he kept it locked down. They were trying to provoke him, trying to get him to do something stupid that would give them an excuse to escalate things. He had seen this playbook before, in bars from North Carolina to California. The script was always the same. "A fellow soldier," David said simply. "Well, that's the risk you take when you sign up to go places you ain't wanted," the thin man said. "Maybe if you folks stayed home and minded your own business, you wouldn't be going to so many funerals." The comment hit harder than David expected. Not because of the racism, he had heard worse, but because there was a grain of truth in it that he had been wrestling with for years. How many friends had he lost to wars that seemed to have no clear purpose or end? How many memorial services had he attended for young men and women who would never come home? But that wasn't the point right now. These men weren't making some philosophical argument about foreign policy. They were just looking for an excuse to hurt someone who looked different from them. Tank moved closer, now standing just a few feet away from David's bar stool. Up close, David could smell cigarettes and motor oil, mixed with the sour scent of too many beers. Tank's eyes were bloodshot, and there was something desperate in his expression that made him more dangerous than simple anger would have. "You know what I think?" Tank said, loud enough for everyone in the bar to hear. "I think you walked into the wrong place tonight. This here's a local establishment. We don't get many visitors, especially not your kind." "My kind?" David asked quietly. "You know exactly what I mean," Tank replied. "People who think they're better than everyone else just because they wear a uniform. People who think they can walk into any place they want and be welcome." It was a clever way to phrase it. On the surface, Tank was talking about soldiers, not race, but everyone in the room understood the real message. David could see it in the uncomfortable shifting of the other customers, in the way Betty had gone, completely white behind the bar. David finished his beer and set the glass down carefully. "I just stopped for a drink," he said. "I'll pay my tab and be on my way." "Oh, you'll be on your way all right," Tank said. "But first I think you owe us an apology." "An apology for what?" Tank smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "For thinking you could just walk in here like you own the place. For disrespecting our town with your presence. For existing." The last word hung in the air like a challenge. David felt something cold settle in his stomach. This wasn't just about intimidation anymore. These men were looking for blood. One of Tank's friends, a stocky man with graying hair, moved to David's left side while another positioned himself near the bar. They were experienced at this, David realized. They had done this before, probably, many times. The coordination was too smooth, too practiced. "Look," David said, standing up slowly from his bar stool. "I don't want any trouble. Let me pay for my drink and I'll leave." "Too late for that," Tank said. "You already caused trouble just by walking through that door." David reached for his wallet, but Tank's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist. The yawn grip was strong and meant to hurt. David could feel the calluses on Tank's palm, the strength built from years of working with his hands. "Did I say you could move?" Tank asked. The room had gone completely silent now except for the sound of the baseball game. Even that seemed muted, as if the television itself was afraid to make too much noise. David looked around the room and saw fear on every face. These people had seen this before, and they knew how it ended. Betty was reaching for something under the bar, probably a phone to call the police. But David could see in her expression that she didn't think help would arrive in time. The nearest sheriff's station was probably 20 miles away, and Tank and his friends would be long gone by the time anyone with a badge showed up. "Let go of my arm," David said quietly. "Or what?" Tank laughed. "You gonna call your sergeant? Maybe write a letter to the president?" The other men joined in the laughter, but David noticed that the young one still looked uncomfortable. There might be hope there, but it wouldn't help him right now. Tank's grip tightened and David felt the bones in his wrist grinding together. Years of military training kicked in, and he began calculating angles and leverage points. He could break, free of the hold, probably take Tank down with a quick strike to the throat or solar plexus. But then what? There were still 4 other men, and violence would only escalate things. "You know what your problem is?" Tank continued, his face now inches from David's. "You think that uniform makes you special. You think it gives you the right to go anywhere you want, do anything you want. But you know what I see when I look at you?" David waited, knowing that Tank was going to tell him anyway. "I see someone who's forgotten his place," Tank said. "Someone who needs to be reminded that there are some places he don't belong." "And you're going to remind me?" David asked. Tank's smile widened. "Oh, we're going to do more than remind you. We're going to make sure you never forget." The threat was clear now. This wasn't going to end with words or intimidation. These men had decided that David needed to be taught a lesson, and they weren't going to stop until they had delivered it. David looked around the room one more time, meeting the eyes of the other customers. He saw fear, yes, but also shame. They knew what was about to happen, and they knew it was wrong, but they weren't going to do anything to stop it. That was the worst part, really. Not the hatred from Tank and his friends. David had dealt with that his entire life. But the silence from everyone else, the willingness to look away while someone was hurt, the decision to prioritize their own safety over doing what was right. Tank released David's wrist and took a step back, giving himself room to move. His friends spread out a little more, making sure David couldn't reach the door. The trap was set and they were ready to spring it. "Last chance," Tank said. "Get on your knees and apologize, and maybe we'll let you crawl out of here with most of your teeth." David straightened his uniform jacket and looked Tank directly in the eyes. "No," he said simply. Tank's expression darkened, and David saw his hand curl into a fist. This was it. The moment when words stopped working and violence took over. David tensed his muscles, ready to defend himself as best he could. But then something unexpected happened. David smiled. It wasn't a nervous smile or a scared smile. It was the kind of smile that comes when someone suddenly realizes they have an advantage that their opponents don't know about. Tank saw it and hesitated, confused by the sudden change in David's demeanor. "You know what?" David said, reaching into his pocket. "I think you're right, I do need to make a call." Tank's eyes narrowed as David slowly pulled his phone from his uniform pocket. The other men shifted nervously, unsure whether David was about to call for backup or try something desperate. The young biker near the door actually took a step backward as if preparing to run. "What do you think you're doing?" Tank demanded, his voice tight with suspicion. David held up his phone, thumb hovering over the screen. "Just making a video call to an old friend," he said casually. "Someone I think you might know." "Put that thing away," the thin man with the scraggly beard snapped. "Nobody wants to be on your little home movie." But David was already swiping and tapping, his movements deliberate and calm. The phone's camera activated, and he held it up so that Tank's face was clearly visible in the frame. Tank instinctively took a step back, his hand moving up as if to block the camera. "Don't you dare point that thing at me," Tank growled. "Too late," David said with that same strange smile. "It's already recording." The atmosphere in the bar shifted again. Where there had been anticipation of violence, now there was confusion and uncertainty. Tank and his friends exchanged glances, clearly not sure how to handle this unexpected development. They had been prepared for David to fight back or beg for mercy, but recording them hadn't been part of their script. David held the phone steady, making sure Tank remained in the center of the frame. "You know, it's funny how small the world can be sometimes," he said, his voice conversational. "I was just at a memorial service today for a buddy of mine. Great kid. Served 3 tours overseas before he was killed in action 2 weeks ago." "What the hell does that have to do with anything?" "Tanny," Kay demanded, but there was something different in his voice now, a hint of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "Well," David continued, still recording, "this kid used to carry a picture in his wallet, showed it to me dozens of times over, the years. Always talked about his old man back home, said they had their differences but he loved him anyway. Even wrote him letters he never sent." Tank's face had gone pale beneath his weathered tan. His friends noticed the change and looked at him with growing confusion. The stocky man who had positioned himself near the bar took a step closer to Tank, as if offering support. "What are you getting at?" Tank asked, but his voice was barely above a whisper now. David tilted the phone slightly, adjusting the angle to get better lighting on Tank's face. "The kid's name was Danny. Danny Rodriguez. Ring any bells?" The effect was immediate and dramatic. Tank stumbled backward as if he had been physically struck, his face going from pale to ashen white. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. The other bikers looked back and forth between David and Tank, clearly confused by their leader's reaction. "Tank?" the thin man said. "What's he talking about?" But Tank wasn't listening to his friends anymore. His eyes were locked on David's phone and his entire body was trembling. David could see recognition dawning in Tank's expression, followed immediately by disbelief and then horror. "Danny?" Tank whispered. "You knew my Danny?" "Your Danny," David said gently, lowering the phone slightly but keeping it recording. "Yeah, I knew him. Served with him for 2.5 years. He saved my life more times than I can count." The silence in the bar was absolute now. Even the baseball game seemed to have gone quiet, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Betty stood frozen behind the bar, her hand still reaching for the phone she had never managed to grab. The other customers sat like statues, afraid that any movement might shatter whatever spell had fallen over the room. Tank's legs seemed to give out, and he sank heavily into the nearest chair. His tough guy facade had completely crumbled, replaced by the face of a broken father who had just been confronted with news about his dead son. "Is he?" Tank started to ask, then stopped. David could see that Tank already knew the answer from his expression, but he needed to hear it spoken aloud. "He died 2 weeks ago," David said quietly. "IED in Afghanistan. He was trying to rescue civilians trapped in a building when it went off." Tank made a sound that was part sob, part moan. His head fell into his hands and his shoulders began to shake. The transformation was so complete and so sudden that his friends didn't know how to react. They had never seen their leader like this, vulnerable and broken. "He talked about you all the time," David continued, his voice gentle but clear enough for everyone in the bar to hear. "Said you taught him how to work on engines when he was a kid. Said you used to take him on motorcycle rides before things got complicated between you two. We had a fight," Tank whispered without lifting his head. "Said some things I shouldn't have said. He left home and never came back. That was 8 years ago. He never stopped loving you," David said. "Even when he was angry. Even when he disagreed with the things you believed, he never stopped hoping you two could work things out someday." Tank looked up then, his eyes red and filled with tears that he wasn't bothering to hide. "He really said that?" David nodded. "He said you were the one who taught him that actions matter more than words, that a man shows who he really is by what he does when nobody's watching." The irony of the statement hung heavy in the air. Here was Tank, faced with the reality of what his actions had nearly led to, threatening and possibly hurting the man who had served alongside his son, who had been there for Danny when Tank couldn't be. "I didn't know," Tank said, his voice cracking. "I didn't know he was a soldier." "Yeah, he was proud of his service. proud to serve his country alongside people from all different backgrounds. He used to say that the military taught him that the only color that matters is the color of the flag on your sleeve. Tank's friends were beginning to understand what was happening, and their expressions ranged from confusion to shame. The young one near the door had tears in his own eyes. The stocky man put a hand on Tank's shoulder, offering silent support to his grief-stricken friend. David put his phone away, having captured what he needed, but he wasn't done talking. Danny kept a letter in his footlocker, David said. He wrote it about 6 months ago but never sent it. Want to know what it said? Tank nodded, unable to speak. It said he was sorry for the fight you had. Sorry for leaving without saying goodbye properly. And sorry that he couldn't find a way to help you see that the hate you carried was eating you alive from the inside. The words hit Tank like physical blows. Each sentence made him flinch as if he was being struck. But he didn't look away, didn't try to defend himself or make excuses. He just sat there and absorbed the truth of what his son had seen in him. He said he understood why you were angry, David continued. Said you'd been hurt by life and didn't know how else to deal with the pain. But he also said he believed you were better than your worst moments, and he hoped someday you'd prove him right. Tank was crying openly now, not caring who saw him or what they thought. The tough biker persona had been completely stripped away, leaving only a heartbroken father who had lost his son before they could reconcile. Where is he buried? Tank asked through his tears. Arlington National Cemetery, David replied. Section 60, row 7. He's got a white headstone with his name, rank and dates of service, and underneath it says, Beloved son and brother in arms. I want to visit him, Tank said. I need to tell him I'm sorry. You can tell him, David said. But first, you need to decide whether you're going to keep living the way he was ashamed of or start living the way he hoped you could. Tank looked around the bar, seeing it as if for the first time. He saw Betty's frightened face, the uncomfortable customers who had witnessed his behavior, his own friends who were staring at him with a mixture of concern and confusion. He saw the man he had been about to attack, who was now offering him compassion instead of condemnation. I don't know how, Tank admitted. I've been angry for so long I don't remember how to be anything else. Your son figured it out, David said. He had the same anger you do. I could see it in him sometimes. But he chose to use it to protect people instead of hurt them. He chose to build bridges instead of walls. Tank wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, leaving streaks on his weathered cheeks. What was he like in the service, I mean? Was he happy? David smiled, and for the first time since entering the bar, it was a completely genuine expression. He was one of the best soldiers I ever served with. Fair, brave, loyal to his friends. He had this laugh that could lift everyone's spirits, even in the worst situations, and he never, ever left anyone behind. That sounds like my Danny, Tanky said quietly. Even as a little kid, he always stuck up for the underdog. He stuck up for me more than once, David said. When other soldiers gave me trouble because of my race, Danny was always the first one to step in. Said his dad taught him that real men don't pick on people who are different, they protect them. Tank's face crumpled again. But that's not what I was doing tonight, was it? I wasn't protecting anybody, I was just being the same kind of bully Danny used to stand up against. No, David agreed. You weren't. But that doesn't mean you can't change. Danny believed people could change. He believed his father could change. Tank stood up slowly, his legs still shaky. He walked over to where David was standing and stopped just a few feet away. For a moment, the entire bar held its breath again, unsure what was about to happen. Then Tank did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He extended his hand toward David. I'm sorry, Tank said simply. For what I almost did. For what I've been. For the pain I've caused people like you over the years. David looked at the offered hand for a long moment. Tank's friends watched nervously, probably expecting David to reject the gesture or use it as an opportunity for revenge. But David saw something in Tank's eyes that convinced him the apology was genuine. He reached out and shook Tank's hand firmly. Apology accepted, David said. Your son would be proud. The handshake lasted longer than either man expected. In that moment, the entire atmosphere of the roadhouse shifted from tension and fear to something much more complex. Tank's friends stood around uncertainly, while the other customers began to relax slightly, though they remained watchful. David reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. Tank watched curiously as David flipped through several photos and documents before finding what he was looking for. He pulled out a photograph and held it so Tank could see it clearly. The picture showed two soldiers in desert camouflage, arms draped over each other's shoulders, grinning broadly at the camera. Both were covered in dust and sweat, their uniforms faded from sun and sand. Behind them, the hazy outline of military vehicles and tents stretched into the distance. "That's Danny on the left," David said quietly. "This was taken about 6 months before he died. We had just finished a particularly tough mission, and someone had a camera." Tank took the photo with trembling hands, holding it as if it were made of glass. His eyes traced every detail of his son's face. Older than when he had last seen him, marked by experience and responsibility, but still recognizably the boy who had grown up in his garage, learning to fix engines and ride motorcycles. "He looks good," Tank whispered. "Strong. Happy." "He was both of those things," David confirmed. Even in the worst situations, Danny found ways to keep everyone's spirits up. He was the kind of person who made everyone around him better. Tank's friends had moved closer, drawn by curiosity to see the photograph. The thin man with the scraggly beard peered over Tank's shoulder, his expression softening as he saw the image. "That's really Tank's boy?" he asked quietly. "That's Danny Rodriguez," David replied. Though he went by his mother's maiden name after, his parents divorced. Danny Thompson was his military name. The revelation hit Tank like a second shock. "Thompson," he repeated. "He took Maria's name." "He said it was easier that way," David explained gently. "Less complicated when it came to military paperwork and benefits, but he never forgot where he came from." Tank nodded slowly, still staring at the photograph. "His mother and we didn't part on good terms. Said some things to each other that we shouldn't have. Danny got caught in the middle of it. He mentioned that," David said. "Said it was one of his biggest regrets that the family fell apart and he couldn't fix it." Betty, who had been listening from behind the bar, finally found her voice. "Would you gentlemen like to sit down? I could bring some coffee or—" "That would be good," Tank said without looking up from the photo. "Thank you, Betty." She nodded and busied herself with the coffee maker, clearly relieved that the threat of violence had passed. The other customers began to relax as well, though they continued to watch the unfolding scene with fascination. David and Tank moved to a table near the window, away from the others. Tank's friends followed at a respectful distance, still trying to process what they had witnessed. The stocky man pulled out a chair for Tank, who sat down heavily, still clutching the photograph. "Tell me about the mission," Tank said suddenly. "The one where he died. I need to know what happened." David hesitated. "Are you sure? Sometimes it's better not to know all the details." "I'm sure," Tank replied firmly. "I need to understand how my son died. I need to know if it meant something." David nodded and settled back in his chair, organizing his thoughts. "We were part of a convoy providing security for a medical team setting up a clinic in a small village. Intelligence said the area was secure, but that's what intelligence always says." Tank's friends had taken seats at a nearby table, close enough to listen but giving the two men space to talk. Betty appeared with a pot of coffee and several mugs, setting them down quietly before retreating again. "The clinic was in an old school building," David continued. "The medical team was treating civilians, mostly women and children who hadn't had access to proper health care in years. We were supposed to provide security while they worked." Tank poured coffee for both of them, his hands steadier now but still trembling slightly. "What went wrong?" "Insurgents had rigged the building next door with explosives," David said. "We didn't know it until civilians started running out, screaming about a bomb. The medical team was trapped inside the clinic with about 20 patients who couldn't be moved quickly. Elderly people, pregnant women, kids with serious injuries." Tank closed his eyes, as if picturing the scene. Danny went in after them. Danny was the first one through the door, David confirmed. The rest of us were setting up a perimeter trying to figure out how much time we had before the bomb went off. But Danny just ran straight into that building without hesitation. That sounds like him, Tank said quietly. Even as a kid, he never could stand by when someone needed help. He saved 12 people, David continued. Made 3 trips into that building, carrying out anyone who couldn't walk on their own. An old man with a broken leg, a pregnant woman in labor, kids who were too scared to move. Tank's eyes were wet again, but he was smiling slightly. 12 people. He was going back for a 4th trip when the building next door exploded, David said. The blast brought down part of the clinic's roof. Danny and 2 others were trapped, under the debris. Did he suffer? Tank asked, his voice barely audible. David reached across the table and put his hand on Tank's arm. It was quick, he said. He didn't suffer. And even in those last moments, he was still trying to help. The medic said he was talking to the other trapped soldiers, keeping them calm until the rescue teams could reach them. Tank nodded, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. He died a hero. He lived a hero, David corrected. The way he died was just one example of how he lived every day, always putting others first, always willing to sacrifice for something bigger than himself. They sat in silence for several minutes, drinking their coffee and absorbing the weight of the story. Tank studied the photograph again, memorizing every detail of his son's face. I have more pictures, David said eventually, and some of his personal effects that the military asked me to deliver to his family. I was planning to mail them to his mother, but what? David pulled out his phone and scrolled through several photos before finding what he was looking for. He showed Tank the screen, which displayed a group photo of about 20 soldiers standing in front of an American flag. This was Danny's unit, David explained. He's in the back row, 3rd from the left. Tank squinted at the small screen, finding his son among the faces. Danny was taller than most of the other soldiers, standing with his characteristic easy smile and confident posture. He looks like a leader, Tank observed. He was, David said. Promoted to sergeant just 2 months before he died. His commanding officer said Danny was one of the finest soldiers he'd ever had the privilege to serve with. David swiped to another photo, this one showing Danny alone, standing next to a military vehicle with mountains in the background. He was wearing sunglasses and grinning at the camera, one hand resting on the hood of the truck. He sent this picture to his mother about a month before he died, David said. Told her he was doing fine and thinking about home. His mother, Tank repeated. Maria, how is she handling this? She's devastated, obviously, David replied. But she's proud too. The whole community has rallied around her. Danny was well loved by everyone who knew him. Tank was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. I should contact her, he said finally. I should go to the funeral. Pay my respects. The funeral was last week, David said gently. But there's going to be a memorial service next month at the VFW hall in his hometown. Maria specifically asked that all of Danny's friends and fellow soldiers be invited. Even me? Tank asked uncertainly. Especially you, David replied. Danny may have taken his mother's name, but he never stopped being your son. Maria knows that. Tank pulled out his own phone, an older model with a cracked screen. Could you give me her number? I'd like to call her if she's willing to talk to me. David hesitated. Are you sure you're ready for that conversation? It might be difficult. I've been avoiding difficult conversations for 8 years, Tank said. That's what got me into this mess in the first place. It's time I started facing things head on. David nodded and gave Tank the phone number, watching as the older man carefully entered it into his contacts. Tank stared at the number for a moment, then looked back at the photograph. What else can you tell me about him? Tank asked. What did he like to do in his free time? What were his plans for after the military? David smiled, settling in for what he could see would be a long conversation. Well, he was still obsessed with motorcycles, had pictures of bikes all over his bunk, said someday he was going to ride Route 66 from end to end. Tank laughed, the first genuine laugh he had made all evening. I taught him to love bikes. We used to plan trips we'd take together when he got older. He talked about that, David said. Said his dad had promised to teach him to rebuild an engine from scratch, and he was still hoping to collect on that promise someday. I still have his first bike in my garage, Tank admitted. A little dirt bike he rode when he was 12. I kept thinking maybe someday he'd come home and want to fix it up with me. He would have loved that, David said. Danny was always talking about the mechanical projects he wanted to tackle when he got out of the service. Said his dad had given him an appreciation for working with his hands. Tank's friends had been listening to the conversation, and David could see the impact the story was having on them as well. The young biker near the door was openly crying now while the others sat in thoughtful silence. I need to make things right, Tank said suddenly. Not just with Maria and Danny's memory, but with everything. The way I've been living. The things I've done. Danny deserved better than that. It's not too late, David said. As long as you're breathing, it's never too late to change. Tank looked around the bar, taking in the faces of his friends and the other customers who had witnessed his transformation. I owe a lot of people apologies, he said, starting with you. You already apologized to me, David reminded him. No, Tank said, shaking his head. I apologize for tonight. But I need to apologize for all the nights like tonight, for all the people I've hurt over the years because of my anger and prejudice. I need to apologize for becoming the kind of man my son was ashamed of. The weight of that realization settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Tank had not only lost his son, but he had also been forced to confront the reality that his son had died disapproving of the man Tank had become. Danny wasn't ashamed of you, David said carefully. He was disappointed in some of your choices, but he never stopped loving you or believing you could be better. How do you know? Tank asked. David reached into his wallet again and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was worn and creased, as if it had been read many times. Because he asked me to give you this if anything ever happened to him. Tank stared at the folded paper in David's hand as if it were something mystical. His own hands trembled as he reached for it, and David could see the mixture of hope and fear in his eyes. This was a message from beyond the grave, a final communication from the son he had lost and might never have reconciled with. Danny wrote this about a year ago, David explained softly. He updated it a few times, but the basic message stayed the same. He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would find you and make sure you got it. Tank unfolded the paper carefully, as if afraid it might crumble at his touch. The handwriting was familiar, the same careful script Danny had used as a child when doing homework at the kitchen table. Tank had to blink several times to clear his vision enough to read. Dad? The letter began, and Tank had to stop reading immediately. He put his head down and took several deep breaths, trying to compose himself enough to continue. David waited, patiently, understanding the emotional weight of the moment. Tank's friends remained silent as well, recognizing that they were witnessing something sacred and private. After a few minutes, Tank lifted his head and began to read aloud, his voice shaky but determined. Dad, if you're reading this, it means something has happened to me and I didn't make it home. I'm sorry for that, and I'm sorry for all the things we never got to say to each other. Tank paused, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. I know we parted angry, and I know you probably think I left because I was ashamed of you or because I didn't love you anymore. But that's not true. I left because I was afraid I was becoming too much like you, angry all the time, looking for someone to blame for everything that went wrong in life. The words hit Tank like physical blows. Each sentence forced him to confront truths about himself that he had spent years avoiding, but he continued reading, driven by the need to hear his son's final thoughts. I joined the army because I wanted to learn how to be a different kind of man. Not because there was anything wrong with being strong or tough or protective. You taught me all of those things and they've served me well. But I wanted to learn how to use those qualities to build things up instead of tearing them down. Tank looked up at David, who nodded encouragingly. Keep reading, David said gently. The military has shown me a lot of things, Tank continued, reading from the letter. I've served alongside people from every background you can imagine. Different races, religions, economic situations. What I've learned is that when your life depends on someone else, none of those differences matter. All that matters is whether they'll have your back when things get tough. Tank's friends were listening intently now, and David could see that Danny's words were having an impact on them as well. The young biker had pulled his chair closer, hanging on every word. "I've had my life saved by people you would probably call enemies," the letter continued. "Black soldiers, Hispanic soldiers, Muslim soldiers, immigrant soldiers. They didn't save me because they had to. They saved me because that's what good people do for each other. And Dad, they are good people. If you could meet them, if you could see what I've seen, you'd understand." Tank had to stop reading again, overwhelmed by the weight of his son's words. He looked around the bar, seeing the faces of people he had threatened and intimidated over the years. People who, according to his son, were exactly the kind of good people who would risk their lives to save others. "There's more," David said quietly. Tank nodded and continued. "I know you're angry about a lot of things, Dad. Angry about Mom leaving, angry about the economy, angry about feeling like the world is changing too fast and leaving you behind. I understand that anger because I felt it too, but I've learned that anger is like fire. It can keep you warm, or it can burn down everything you care about. The choice is yours." The metaphor was simple but powerful, and Tank could see its truth immediately. His anger had indeed burned down everything he cared about: his marriage, his relationship with his son, his place in the community. It had turned him into someone his own child was afraid of becoming. "I want you to know that I still love you," Tank read, his voice breaking. "I love the man who taught me to ride a bike and fix engines and stand up for myself. I love the man who worked double shifts to keep food on the table and never complained about being tired. I love the man who used to read me bedtime stories and check under my bed for monsters." Tank remembered those moments vividly. Danny as a small boy, gap-toothed and innocent, climbing into his lap with a picture book. It seemed like a lifetime ago before everything went wrong, before anger and resentment poisoned their relationship. "That man is still inside you somewhere," the letter continued. "I believe that with all my heart. And if something happens to me, I want you to find him again. Not for me, it'll be too late for me. But for yourself, and for all the people whose lives you could make better instead of worse." Tank folded the letter carefully and set it on the table. For several minutes, no one in the bar spoke. The only sounds were the distant hum of the air conditioning and the muted noise from the television. Finally, Tank looked up at David. "How long have you been carrying this?" "Since the day after he died," David replied. "I promised him I would find you no matter how long it took. And you found me here tonight just when I was about to become exactly the kind of person he was disappointed in." "Maybe that's not a coincidence," David suggested. "Maybe Danny is still looking out for people even now." Tank smiled through his tears. He always did believe in signs and fate and things happening for a reason. Betty approached the table hesitantly, carrying a fresh pot of coffee. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but I just wanted to say how sorry I am for your loss, and how proud you should be of your son. What he did, saving all those people, that takes real courage." Tank looked up at her, this woman he had frightened earlier in the evening. "Thank you," he said simply. "And I owe you an apology for the way I acted tonight. You didn't deserve that." Betty's expression softened. "We all have bad days," she said kindly. "What matters is what we do next." Tank's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it and saw a text message from one of his friends who hadn't come to the bar that night. "The guys are wondering where we are," he said to his companions. "Should I tell them we're having a change of heart about some things?" The young biker spoke up for the first time. "Tank, I've been thinking about what your son wrote, about anger being like fire. I don't want to be the kind of person who burns things down anymore." The others nodded in agreement. The stocky man cleared his throat and said, "Maybe it's time we started acting like the kind of men Danny would have respected." Tank stood up, slowly, feeling older than his years but also somehow lighter. "David, would you be willing to come with me to visit Danny's grave? I'd like to have someone there who knew him who can tell me more stories about the man he became." "I'd be honored," David replied. And I think Maria would like to meet you too. She has a lot of pictures and memories to share. I'm scared, Tank admitted. What if she hates me? What if she blames me for Danny leaving home? She might be angry at first, David said honestly. But Danny got his capacity for forgiveness from somewhere. I think you'll find that his mother has the same generous heart he did. Tank picked up the letter and folded it carefully, placing it in his wallet next to his driver's license. I want to carry this with me, he said, to remind me of the man I should be trying to become. David stood as well and extended his hand again. It's been an honor meeting you, Tank. Danny would be proud of the conversation we've had tonight. Thank you, Tank said, shaking David's hand firmly. For bringing me his message, for sharing his stories, for giving me a chance to be better. Tank turned to address his friends. I need to ask you guys for something. I need your help changing the way we've been living, not just tonight, but going forward. Danny died protecting people who were different from him, and I want to honor that. Oh. The group looked at each other uncertainly. Change was never easy, especially for people who had been set in their ways for decades, but the impact of the evening's events was clear on all their faces. What are you asking us to do? The thin man asked. I'm asking you to help me become the kind of father Danny deserved, Tank replied. The kind of man who builds bridges instead of walls. The kind of person who makes the world a little bit better instead of a little bit worse. Betty had been listening from behind the bar, and she stepped forward with a suggestion. You know, there's a community center downtown that could use some volunteers. They run programs for underprivileged kids, teach them life skills and trades. Some of you guys know about engines and mechanics. You could teach those skills to young people who need opportunities. Tank considered this. Teaching kids to work on bikes and cars? Exactly, Betty said. Turn your knowledge into something positive. Give kids who might not have father figures something constructive to do with their time. The idea seemed to resonate with Tank's friends. The young biker sat up straighter and said, I'd like that. I always wished I had someone to teach me things when I was growing up. Then that's where we'll start, Tank decided. Small steps, but in the right direction. David gathered his things and prepared to leave. The long drive home to his sister's house still awaited him, but the weight on his shoulders felt considerably lighter than when he had first entered the roadhouse. One more thing, Tank said, as David reached the door. The memorial service you mentioned, the one at the VFW hall. When is it exactly? Third Saturday of next month, David replied. 2:00 in the afternoon. I'll be there, Tank promised. And if it's okay with you, I'd like to say something about the son I lost, and the son I'm proud of. I think Danny would like that very much, David said. As David walked out into the parking lot, he could hear voices behind him. Tank and his friends making plans to visit the community center, talking about how they could use their skills to help instead of hurt. The motorcycles were still parked near the entrance, but somehow they looked different now. Less threatening, more like simple machines that could take people places they needed to go. David got into his car and sat for a moment before starting the engine. He thought about Danny, about the promise he had made to deliver that letter, about the chain of events that had led him to this small roadhouse on this particular night. Maybe it was coincidence, or maybe it was something more. Either way, he had kept his promise to his fallen friend. Danny's message had been delivered, and perhaps more importantly, it had been received by someone ready to hear it. The transformation wouldn't happen overnight, but Tank had taken the first crucial step, acknowledging that change was necessary and possible. As David drove away, he could see Tank through the roadhouse window, showing the photograph to Betty and his friends, telling them stories about the son he had lost and found again in the same evening. It was the beginning of a long journey, but it was a beginning. Danny Rodriguez had saved 12 lives in Afghanistan. Tonight, David thought, he might have saved one more from a different kind of destruction. The letter had done exactly what Danny had hoped it would do. It had reminded his father that it was never too late to become the man you were meant to be. The highway stretched ahead, leading David home to his family and Tank toward a future that was uncertain but full of possibility. Behind them, the roadhouse remained lit against the darkness, a place where two strangers had found connection in the memory of a young man who had believed in the power of people to change for the better. And somewhere, perhaps, Danny Rodriguez was smiling.